Moses stands on a vast plain. Rugged mountains rise in the distance behind him. And before him is spread out the whole congregation of Israel, or what's left of them, the remnants of the long, fearful trek through the howling wilderness. They are emotionally drained. They are physically exhausted, having spent years being simultaneously challenged by and graced with God's abiding presence. And here on the plains of Moab, they stop. They rest. They reflect. They review and renew the covenant before moving on, before the final push into the promised land. Now, the next part of their journey will be different, but not really easier than the one that they've just concluded. The land that they're going to may be flowing with milk and honey, but getting there will require blood and tears, toil and sweat. In the desert, there was only howling winds and themselves and Moses and God to complain about. In Canaan, there will be more direct confrontations with people who do not believe the same things they do, who see the world very differently, and who are not easy to live with. Deuteronomy is not a book that we spend a lot of time with, generally, and its inclusion today may seem somewhat arbitrary. I mean, we don't get a lot of continuity with our Old Testament readings in Epiphany. First Genesis, and then Samuel, then Jonah. And then back to Genesis for the beginning of Lent. It's hard to keep track of where we are. But Deuteronomy is a very appropriate selection for today, because the whole book is this moment of pause. It's a break in the narrative. It's a time in between. It's not even quite clear if Deuteronomy is really the end of the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, the end of the desert wandering, or if it's more like the beginning of the histories, Joshua, Judges, and Kings, the beginning of being settled in the land. It lies in between both of those, at a point when they're not quite finished with their wilderness journey, nor have they yet reached the promised land. Moses is on the verge of death, and he knows that he will not enter the land with them. And so he pauses the trek and speaks to them in 3 long valedictory addresses. He reviews their history. He expounds upon the law given at Horeb, which is another name for Sinai, and he reminds them to be loyal to God and to uphold the covenant. The book we call Deuteronomy, which means second law because Moses reviews the law a second time in it, in Hebrew is simply called Devarim, the words, because these are the words that Moses addressed to all Israel on the other side of the Jordan. Now, I am not in any way Moses, but I stand before you today in a still almost empty church with the whole congregation spread out before me in your own homes, a vast virtual plain. And today we pause to rest, to review, and to remember our recently renewed covenant and to prepare ourselves for the next phase of our journey. It has not been an easy year. It has been a year of grief and exhaustion, a year of upheaval, and a year of creativity. It's been a year of unimaginable loss and a year of incomparable generosity. 2020 was nowhere near what the Israelites experienced in their 40-year trek in the wilderness, an experience that, in the words of one scholar, tried the soul of the nation. But history doesn't have to exactly repeat in order for it to rhyme. The soul of our nation has also been tried and will continue to be tried. This past year, we've learned how deeply and inextricably woven together the fabric of all life is. We learned how much we rely on and miss our families and our friends, our church communities. Our eyes were opened to how deeply we rely on people we rarely gave a thought to before. Those who stock shelves and clean buildings, who hold devices up so that sick or elderly relatives can have video chats with us. And that's not even to mention those who create and distribute vaccines. We also learned how threadbare and tattered the fabric of our communities really are. We saw afresh the hard realities of racial injustice, economic disparity, and political polarization as they became overt, painful, and impossible to ignore. In our desert of 2020, we began to reckon with how truly complicated and deeply wounded our world really is. But it has also been a year of rediscovering a greater portion of God's grace. As our ears rang with God's call to do justice and love goodness and walk humbly, our hearts and our hands reached out to take part in God's work of feeding the hungry, being peacemakers, repairers of the breach, being healers, and clearly marking the path through the wilderness, marking the way of love so that others can follow. We are not ancient Israelites, but we too have been forged in our own wilderness crucible, forged to be a people dedicated to God and a blessing to our communities. As we pause today and look back over where we have been, we also look to the future. And we look forward with hope, knowing that we will likely be gathering together before too long, and with eyes better trained to see the new things that God is doing in our midst. We look forward with courage, knowing that our faith in God and our connections with one another have been tempered and strengthened. We look forward with gratitude, knowing that God's abundance and our shared generosity continues to provide resources to meet the challenges and continue to do God's work from this place. And there will continue to be challenges. We all know that. There are legions of unclean spirits around that must be repeatedly named. Mendacity, racism, sexism, every kind of phobia. They must be named and exorcised. And we also know that there are plentiful opportunities for repentance and for making reparations. There is a lot of work to be done. But with God leading us, and with this community surrounding us at our sides and having our backs, I, for one, am ready to move forward into this new land and further in to God's promise. Aren't you?